Well, to talk about this is Bridget Harris, the former special advisor to Nick Clegg, and one of the women who says she was one of the victims of Lord Rennard's alleged sexual harassment. And Tim Farron MP, the Liberal Democrat Party president, also Harriet Harman MP, the Labour Party deputy leader and longest-serving female MP in the Commons. We did, of course, ask Lord Rennard himself to come on so he could have his say. We also asked a number of his supporters, but we got no's to all of our requests. Tim Farron, Lord Rennard has said that he's considering legal action tonight. You must be viewing that with some apprehension.
Not particularly. Obviously, he's entitled to take whatever advice he wishes and to take what action he wants to pursue. I think it's sad if that is the process that he wants to undertake. When all said and done, I think the party, going back many years, has not covered itself in glory. In fact, it's done quite the opposite when not dealing properly with complaints that were made, rumours that circulated. We were unfair not just to the women who had the complaints, but also to Lord Rennard himself. Because if you are complained against, it's probably far better for it to be dealt with than for it to be allowed to fester. But I don't think we have done anything wrong in terms of our conduct in the 11 months since this came out into the open.
So when you read in Lord Rennard's statement that he had been suffering from depression, he's got serious health problems, and he's given the party such a debt of service, do you feel he hasn't been treated fairly in all of this then? I
don't think any of those statements about Chris Rennard are inaccurate. Clearly, he has worked incredibly hard for the party, and that's an understatement. And I also feel, I have to say, immense compassion for him if that's the kind of ordeal he has gone through, and it doesn't surprise me. It's bound to be very difficult to have gone through it. But I have to say, I also feel immense compassion for those people who allege harassment, and it's important that we have a duty of care to those people. I believe we let them down over a number of years, and it's time we put that right.
Well, Bridget Harris, when you read Lord Rennard's statement today, where he says he's been enormously distressed by what's happened today, he's endured a humiliating trial by media, do you feel any sympathy for him?
Yes, of course, and on a personal level, I do have a lot of sympathy and compassion, and I completely agree with Tim. I mean, I think this has been traumatic for every Liberal Democrat to have either been involved directly or to have been watching it remotely, and certainly, for somebody like Chris to have gone through all of this, of course I can understand why it's been very, very distressing, and nobody wants to go through this, and I think it was the absence of a proper process in the beginning, and Tim, I think, was very good to acknowledge a couple of days ago that this was allowed to fester, and it shouldn't have done. We should have dealt with this when Chris was chief executive of the party, and not now. But
with Lord Rennard today has expressed regret if he's ever hurt, embarrassed or upset anyone. Does that get anywhere near to what you're demanding of him in the party?
Well, on a personal level, I can speak for me personally. Obviously, I can't speak for how the other women feel. But on a personal level, I'm quite happy to accept the sincerity of what Chris has said today, absolutely. But I think we've gone beyond that now, because really what this became a trial of is the message that the Lib Dems were sending out to women and young people and equalities people about how they could deal with and were they capable of dealing with complaints of our kind. And I think that that's really where we need to end and get a proper conclusion around, is that the Lib Dems are capable of dealing with complaints such as this. And I do welcome the announcements that were made today, and certainly the statements by Nick and Tim.
OK. Tim Farron, this is now the third inquiry. You've heard what distress all of this has caused Bridget Harris there. At some point, as I say, third inquiry, if you include the police inquiry, at some point someone's got to take a decision in the party about whether Lord Rennard is welcome or not.
Well, what happens is that we are a prisoner of our own democracy, and I don't actually want to slate our democracy. It is good to be an open and democratic party that believes in process.
But
it just doesn't look very good in front of the cameras.
Leadership is another. I mean, Nick Clegg could have done what he's done today. He could have done that a week ago.
No, he couldn't. I mean, the outcome of last week's report was that, OK, there wasn't a burden of proof sufficient for intent to be proven, but clearly an apology was requested, distress and upset had been caused. That responsibility was pinned. There was a conclusion endorsed by a party committee, and Lord Rennard, I'm afraid, chose to flout that. So it's on the basis of that he's now had his membership suspended.
But Nick Clegg first knew of these concerns, what, 6 years ago, indirect issues were raised with his office. He could have grappled this issue much earlier, couldn't he?
Well, I think the party as a whole could. I think it's incredibly unfair to land this at Nick's door. A lot of these, or certainly some of these incidents, alleged incidents, took place before he was even an MP, never mind party leader. And the reality is, I don't think either I or Nick are in a position, it would be ludicrous if he even tried to defend the Liberal Democrats' handling of this going back a decade. But we can absolutely do our best to make sure we put things right now.
But what about the handling of this going back a week? I mean, it's looked farcical, hasn't it? Shambolic even. And
well,
here you are trying to be the junior
at.
partner of a coalition.
Process does. I mean, you could, as some parties and organisations do, have, as I think was alluded to earlier on by Mark Pack, a system where the leader can just make dictats and everything happens, and that might look good for the cameras.
Do you feel proud of what's happened the last week, do you?
No, of course I don't feel proud of any of all this, but I think the last week we've not handled it badly. I think we've handled it in accordance with correct process. The reality is, and the focus must be, on how we allow this issue to fester over a number of years, and how we let down the women concerned, the 4 women who have made the complaints, and indeed, as I said, Lord Rennard also, because if you are complained against and you're not allowed to have those issues properly dealt with, then you also suffer.
Harriet, Harman, is this a Lib Dem problem, or does Labour have this kind of problem with alleged harassment as well?
Well, I think every political party, indeed every organisation, ought to be alert to the risk of sexual harassment and have a culture which is quite clear about what is appropriate and what isn't appropriate. So you can't have people saying, oh, I thought that was perfectly all right. You know, you need to really set it out that women in an organisation should not have to be touched, squeezed, patted, the victim of innuendos. So you need to be absolutely specific about it. And then you need to, when complaints are made, take them very seriously and have proper enforcement, and also enforcement not by a male hierarchy. And there's 2 things I'd like to just say.
Just before you go on
this.
to say those things,
okay.
though, if you could just address this specific point. Women working in Westminster now will have seen the way that the Lib Dems have handled this inquiry, the way it's been bungled the last week, but many years before that. And that surely, doesn't it underline the fact that Westminster is still an old boys' network, essentially?
Well, you know, obviously in Westminster, across all the parties, there needs to be an awareness of this. But can I just say 2 things? Firstly, you know, I really do want to speak up for those women who've had the courage to complain. And I feel slightly uncomfortable about the fact that they are being pushed into a position, that they have been told they're distressed, which is like saying they're hysterical, and that they've got to start apologising to Lord Rennard for what he feels. That's my first concern.
Well, let me put that direct point to Bridget Harris just now.
One more, Cathy, which is, I think the reaction at that press conference when you put that question was really disturbing, because that was a press conference on mental health and Nick Clegg was speaking at it. I mean, there are women up and down the country whose mental health is undermined by sexual harassment, and the idea that you had to be, you know, inhibited in asking your question, I think the message from that will go out to women is you better not speak up about sexual harassment, because you know, people don't want to face up to it. So I think really the culture's got to change, the rules have got to be cleared, and they've all got to be enforced, and that's not what's happening.
Let me put those points to Bridget Harris. The language used that you've distressed, and the sort of implication that somehow you've been hysterical about this, has that been traumatic for you?
Well, I think Harriet makes an excellent point. When you first approached me, Cathy, a year ago and put the details of the allegations of the other women to me, which was the first time I'd ever heard them, and asked me whether I'd be prepared to speak on your programme, I considered the idea of doing it anonymously or something like that. But then I thought, hang on a second, I have nothing to hide, and I've always made it very clear to any party manager that's ever asked me that if they were prepared to put forward a proper procedure in place to investigate the allegations, I would participate. And at the time, a year ago, when I did that interview, many people afterwards said, well, you're very brave, this is a huge risk, you know, well done. And I actually refuse to think that this is something where basically I am at risk, or my career is at risk, or that I will be denigrated or put down by the outside world because I've chosen to say this. Because, as Harriet says, it is not my responsibility the way somebody else chooses to behave. I'm not responsible for that.
Bridget Harris, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we're completely out of time. Bridget Harris, Harriet Harman, Tim Farron, thank you very much for joining me.